During the Vietnam War, 80% of soldiers were volunteers. For the remaining 20%, the government turned to the draft. Many men attempted to avoid the draft because they did not agree with the connotations of the war.
Alright, take that.
Some men did this by marrying other men, as gays were not allowed in the military.
Of your love forever together.
Many men also feigned medical issues. These included binging on sugar to fake diabetes, smoking ink-dipped cigarettes to fake tuberculosis, and swallowing cotton balls to make shadows show up on x-rays. Thousands of draft dodgers also fled to Canada, where they were greeted with hostels and job openings. Because draft numbers were suffering, Nixon stated that the few hundred people who had fled to Canada would be punished. This was a difficult task considering the few hundred people turned into 68,000 Dodgers. In an effort to save the draft, the government asked famous artists to compose and perform patriotic songs that promoted the war. They received 0 songs. Because their peers were the primary targets for the draft, collegiate students were the main protesters during this era. A majority of these collegiate protests took place during Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency from 1963 to 1969. This was primarily due to the fact that a majority of draftees had been embarked during this time period. Confused and outraged, the students channeled these emotions into protests and demonstrations. For example, the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, was founded in 1959 under ideals published by Tom Hayden. While this organization started small, eventually a national march was held on Washington, D.C., involving thousands of collegiate students from all over the nation. One of the largest collegiate protests was held in Berkeley, California, and included over 10,000 students. This protest was held by the Vietnam Day Committee, and hundreds of students were witnessed burning their draft cards. While many of these mass protests remained peaceful, some individual demonstrations became disturbingly violent. Norman Morrison, a 32-year-old Vietnam extremist and father of 3, stood outside the Pentagon building, doused himself in kerosene, and set himself on fire, losing his life in protest of the war. However, as the number of student protesters increased, authority was unsure of how to keep them in control. When a protest got out of control on May 4, 1970, 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard. As a result, 4 million students across the nation went on strike in over 450 schools. When the British invasion came to the U.S. in the 1960s, influential bands such as the Beatles, The Who, and the Rolling Stones wrote powerful songs in opposition to the war. While the youth widely responded to these new songs, adults frowned upon the new music and the countercultural subdivisions such as hippies, who were known for experimental drugs and disobeying authority. Woodstock was a music festival that promised 3 days of peace and music. Jimi Hendrix's rendition of the national anthem was said to be one of the most powerful pieces played, as it silenced the entire crowd within seconds. While Nixon was president, he received so many letters regarding the Vietnam War that he could not formulate an individual response to all of them. Instead, Noble M. Mellencamp, an assistant to the president, sent out an automatic response to every letter that was received. The country had been involved in the war for almost 20 years, and it was clear that it was becoming unwinnable. Although Nixon claimed that he was going to end the war, about a third of the casualties occurred during his presidency. Over the course of the Vietnam War, there were over 60,000 American deaths. In all, over 4 times as many people dodged the draft.